If you have your Bibles, I'd like to invite you to turn to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12, and I'm going to read verses 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The Lord wants us to be transformed. Well, I would like to take a moment and tell you about a very interesting individual. The message this morning is based on this person. It's called Sister Gabby. Sister Gabby's spell more specifically. Now, you've got to listen carefully because there's a story connected with Sister Gabby. The Miller family was your typical American family. You had Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller, and there were 3 little Millers. They had a 16-year-old daughter named Beth, 11-year-old boy named Billy, and he was sometimes called Junior after Mr. Miller, and then there was Tammy, about 5-year-old girl. And their days were filled with a lot of the same things as the typical American family. The kids went to school, and Dad went to work, and Mom had her part-time work plus the housework, and afternoons were filled with things like homework and music lessons, soccer. And in many ways, they just fit into the picture of what you might see as a very typical family. Well, Mr. Miller's mother, Grandma Miller, lived with the family until she was overcome with cancer. She had lived in what you'd call a mother-in-law apartment downstairs, and it had its own entrance. But she became ill. She passed away. And after the Millers recovered from grieving about the loss of Grandma Miller, they thought, we've got this empty room right near our front door. It's got its own entrance. It's got its own bathroom. Maybe we could rent it out. The kids have plenty of room. It'll produce a little income for the family and put it towards a college fund. They talked about that as a family. Thought, that'd probably be a good idea. And so they put an ad in the paper, and it wasn't very long before they've got someone who responded. A very interesting lady by the name of Gabriella T. Seymour. And I don't know what the T stood for, but she wanted to include that. You would think Gabriella Seymour would be good enough. You can understand when a person's got the name John Smith, they might put an initial in there to help identify them from the other John Smiths out there. But they interviewed her, and they'd never met anybody quite like her. She was the most interesting person that you could imagine. First of all, her life, she'd done everything. She had been a nurse in the Korean War, and that somehow led into her being an international news correspondent. She told some stories that she actually had some experience as a spy because of her experience as a news correspondent. And she had been a novelist, and also what really appealed to the Millers is she had been a school teacher. And they thought, could you help our kids with their homework? Oh, I love children. I'd love to help them with their homework. And there was just something about this lady was so interesting to talk to. Her eyes just flashed when she spoke. And she began to even tell all these different stories about her adventures. And they thought, well, we've got to hear more about this. Tell you what, here's the price. We'll rent you the room. She said, great. And before long, she moved in. Now, she insisted that they don't call her Gabriella or Mrs. Seymour. She said, just call me Sister Gabby. So it's a long story, but just call me Sister Gabby. That's what I answer to. I thought, well, that's good enough for us. So Sister Gabby moved into the room. And, it wasn't long before she sort of became part of the family. She agreed to help the children with their homework, and they just loved her. Because while she was doing homework with them, she would invariably tell them some stories of her adventures, and they were all exciting and very interesting. Stories about the war, and stories about, Beth loved hearing the stories about all her romances that she'd had. She'd had quite a few romances, traveling the world as she did. And some of the things that she would tell Beth Mr. and Mrs. Miller probably wouldn't approve of, but they developed this special relationship when they were together, and she'd tell about all of her boyfriends that she had traveling the world, and Beth really enjoyed talking to her. And when Billy was alone with her doing homework, she'd say, not only was I a nurse during the Korean War, and I was a reporter, but for a while I was a crime scene photographer. Billy, you ought to hear about some of the crime scenes and the things I've seen and the accidents and the murders. And Billy thought, oh, man. And he couldn't wait to do homework with Sister Gabby because she had so many stories to tell. And then little Tammy really enjoyed her time with Sister Gabby because you know how most people might have like 200 muscles in their face to express things when they're talking? There was something freaky about Sister Gabby. She had 400 muscles in her face. And when she was talking, she could do the most amazing convolutions and expressions, and where a person's eyebrows might go up and down a little bit, hers would go up and down independently, and she would cross her eyes and make little Tammy laugh as she told these stories, and she could even wiggle her ears. And so she was just the most interesting person. But it wasn't just the children. Mr. and Mrs. Miller really thought Sister Gabby was fascinating. When she was with little Tammy, 5 years old, she could relate to little Tammy and keep her busy for hours. But when she was talking to Mr. and Mrs. Miller, she showed that she was actually very intelligent and sophisticated. And just like that, she could switch from talking to the children to talking to little Billy to talking to Beth to talking to Mr. and Mrs. Miller. And she was the most broadly educated, fascinating person you could imagine. And there was no end to the stories. So whenever she was at the table, she talked. That was one thing. Her name, Gabby, it was appropriate. Because she had a gift for gab. And she would talk and talk and talk. And even when they came up downstairs and got anywhere near her room, they'd hear her in there talking to herself. Now, she did have a computer in there, and she had friends around the world, and sometimes she would Skype her friends. And by the way, one of the things she asked when she moved in, she said to the Millers, I don't want to be any trouble, but I do keep connected with my friends all over the world, and boy, your internet connection is really slow. Is there any way you could upgrade the connection a little bit so I could stay in touch with my friends? And she said, I keep up with the news, and they said, all right, well, it'll cost a little bit. Well, we'll do that. So they upgraded the internet connection to help Sister Gabby so that she could stay in touch with her friends. But there was almost always a conversation coming out of her room. And they enjoyed her company. They'd let her come in and help with homework. Well, first the kids would go to her little apartment and do the homework, but gradually she kind of migrated her way into the Miller's living room doing the homework because it was a little more spacious. And then she'd be talking to Mrs. Miller when Mrs. Miller was doing her work. And she was so interesting that you just couldn't do something else and listen to Sister Gabby. She was very talkative, but she was also interesting. She was one of these people that when she was talking, you just had to stop what you were doing and pay attention. And if for no other reason, watching her facial expressions when she talked. And she was so animated. Now, she did have arthritis, which prevented her from doing some work, but she still moved plenty when she talked and had a lot of body language. And she just could captivate your attention and entertain you for hours. Mr. Miller would come home from work, and that'd be the time when sometimes they'd bond as a family, but if Sister Gabby was in there helping one of the kids with homework, everyone else would be quiet and listen to the stories that she'd tell. And then they'd find that Mr. Miller, instead of visiting with Mrs. Miller, he'd start talking to Sister Gabby. And she had just so many stories to tell and so many interesting adventures. He'd ask her questions. She always had an answer for anything. Matter of fact, they thought nobody could possibly have lived as much in one lifetime as she claimed to have lived. They asked her where she was born, and she always kind of avoided the question. She said, I wasn't born, I was invented. And she just smiled, kind of a wiry smile, and ignored the question. Seemed to have a mysterious background, but she seemed to know what she was talking about, so they took what she was saying that it must be true. Well, it was only a few months until pretty soon Sister Gabby was like part of the family. She didn't spend much time in her room anymore. Matter of fact, she didn't even go to her room anymore unless everyone else went to sleep. As soon as she heard anyone come in and out of the house, because she was right by the front door, she'd open the door and she'd begin to gab. and she'd start talking to them and visit with everybody. And everybody liked her. She was very interesting, but some things started changing after a few months. First of all, after the first 90 days of her being there, she had been paying her rent just like clockwork. But she told Mr. Miller, she said, I'm having a little problem with my assistance check that's coming in. And if you could please be patient with me, I'm going to be struggling to make my payment this month. Well, the idea of booting Sister Gabby out on the street when she was helping the kids with the homework and she was just like a part of the family now, he'd never even really mentioned that again. But the checks didn't come anymore either. And so she was sort of just living there. She kept her apartment clean and seemed to take care of things in that way, but other things began to happen. Billy started to tell an off-color joke one day, and Mrs. Miller said, "Billy, where did you hear that? Did you hear that at school?" He said, "No." Mrs. Miller said, "Where did you hear that?" And he looked toward Sister Gabby's room. Oh, Mrs. Miller thought, she's had a lot of salty experience, and she shouldn't be sharing that with an 11-year-old boy. And so when Mrs. Miller said something to Sister Gabby said, "Well, Mrs. Miller, it's a big world out there, and they're going to hear these things sooner or later. And so you may as well just have them get used to it young while they're in your home, and you can help sort these things out so they can process it. It's better if they hear these things while they're in the home." Well, she put it in such a sweet way that she didn't know how to answer. She always had an answer for everything. If the truth be known, Sister Gabby was a master manipulator. And Mrs. Miller began to resent that when Mr. Miller came home and after the kids were fed, and they never really got to eat alone anymore because they felt bad, Sister Gabby would sort of be wandering around right around dinner time. And so they naturally wanted to invite her, they were a Christian family, to eat with them, and so she always ate with them. And they'd never seen anybody who could eat so much, and yet she didn't gain any weight. But that wasn't true for everybody else in the family. And she had an opinion on cooking. She'd been a cook too. Did I mention that? Oh yeah, she'd done everything. You name it, she'd done it. And she had all these recipes, and she'd tell them, and some of them were pretty good. And when they'd pull one product out of the refrigerator and put it on the table, she'd say, "That's not bad, but you really ought to get the good stuff. You deserve it." Matter of fact, when Mrs. Miller would go to the supermarket, Gabby started writing out a list for her and saying, "These are the quality products. You really will be much happier if you use these." And she'd extol the virtues of all these other kitchen products and groceries. And Mrs. Miller thought this was sort of a subtle hint that she liked these things better and didn't like the products that she'd been buying, and so she began to buy what Sister Gabby wanted. But it bothered her that when Mr. Miller came home, and she'd start talking to him the time when Mrs. Miller wanted to talk to him, and they never really got to talk much anymore. And if they ever tried to go out and be by themselves, she didn't know what kind of stories that Sister Gabby was going to be telling the kids, because Beth's mind was full of romance stories now. All the adventures and the eloping and all the thing that Sister Gabby did in her youth. Beth was hearing about all this, and she was living in dreamland all the time, hoping that she'd have some similar adventures. And little Billy, he was hearing about all the war stories she had, and when she was a crime scene photographer, and when she worked as a spy, and he began to just be completely absorbed in that world. And then she could entertain little Tammy for hours with her goofy stories and her impersonations and the funny sounds that she'd make. And this went on for quite a while. Well, during the day when Mrs. Miller would normally go to her tennis practice, Gabby would start telling her a story and says, "Let me tell you something." And the stories were always interesting. So it was hard to choose between, do I go out, sweat and exercise, or do I listen to a fascinating story? And every day they started having a little tea time together. And Sister Gabby would tell amazing stories to Mrs. Miller, and Mrs. Miller would sit